Hi, everyone, and welcome to discuss the economic war between the United States and China. We are joined by Professor Jeffrey Sachs, a renowned economist who spends a lot of his time advising governments across the world. So, welcome back to the program.
Well, great to be with you always, Glenn.
So, we can look at this tech rivalry or the currency competition, the efforts to repatriate supply chains. However, if we take, I guess, a step back, what do you see as the wider developments here? How can we understand this point in history? Because this is not your everyday trade war. It seems as if we've had a Western-centric world order now for centuries, and we now see this being contested, or at least not necessarily the order, but China is now outpacing the West. That is, the world is becoming much less Western-centric. We haven't really seen this in a while, or at all.
Well, this is the right way to ask the question of what's happening is to take the long view. Uh, most of the world population lives in Asia, about 60%. Uh, for most of history, that means that roughly 60% of the world economy, world output, was produced in Asia, as best one can tell when historians look back and try to recreate economic estimates. In recent centuries, that changed decisively with the rise of Europe and of the North Atlantic, because in the 19th and 20th centuries, of course, the United States rose to become the largest economy in the world. Asia was eclipsed in this. Not only eclipsed, of course, it was dominated by European imperial powers. If you look around 1820 or so, Asia was still more than half of the world economy. But by 1950, after 150 years of the industrial age dominated by Europe and the United States, the whole Asian economy had declined to around 20% of world output from what had been roughly 60%. This meant China completely being eclipsed and, in fact, of course, attacked and losing many wars, first to the West in the First and Second Opium Wars, to chaos during the so-called Taiping Rebellion in the middle of the 19th century, to the extraterritorial privileges or rights or dominance of European powers in China at the end of the 19th century, and then to Japanese invasion in several episodes, starting with the Sino-Japanese War in 1894-95, and then several Japanese invasions, in fact, in the 20th century, and the massive invasions of the 1930s. Civil War in China in the 1940s. And this meant that by the time of the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949, China had gone through about 110 years of devastating defeats, what China calls the century of humiliation. China's share of the world economy uh, was is estimated to be maybe 2% of world output and roughly 20% of world population as of the 1950s. In other words, China was completely eclipsed from its long historical role in the world for at least a millennium, by the way, from 500 to 1500 AD, before the beginning of the European ascendancy. China clearly dominated the world across many technologies, uh, gunpowder, the steam engine, paper currency, the compass, large scale ocean navigation, and one could go on, in fact. So, the story, Glenn, that we see today, taken from a very, very long term perspective in history, is the return of China to the front ranks of power in the world and economic productivity and technology. In a sense, China has returned to its more traditional role in the world, which one could see for much of the last 2,000 years, in fact. The rise of China in this sense should be understood as a rebalancing of what was absolutely unbalanced, and that is a European dominated world. Of course, it's very hard for Europeans and Americans to understand that the idea of European dominance in the world has become an absolute natural standby. And that's been true for several hundred years, actually, where as Europe rose in power, as European empires dominated the other parts of the world, full ideologies, belief systems, rewriting of history, a lot of racism, one can add even by the leading thinkers of world history in the West, came to say, well, Europe's dominance is natural. European cultural superiority, maybe racial superiority, uh, but whatever the argument was, European superiority is natural. Of course, now we're at the end of that phase of history. And one should understand it's not only the return of China, it's also the rapid development of India. It's the rapid development of Southeast Asia, the so-called ASEAN countries. It's the rapid development of parts of West Asia in the Gulf countries, for example. All of this is rather fundamentally ending the Eurocentric view of the world, or what in the late 19th century to the early 21st century became the North Atlantic NATO centered vision of the world. And by the end of the 20th century became the American centered vision of the world. And when you have these temporary imbalances of economy and power, as I said, you also put a bulwark under them, or I say you, I mean the tendency is that a bulwark is put under them in ideological or religious or some other philosophical sense to say that imbalance is natural. In the United States, the idea of American exceptionalism is very deep. The idea that, yes, of course, America rules the world is a deep part of the belief system, not a superficial item. So the rise of China is viewed with alarm. It's viewed with disdain. It's viewed with fear. It's not viewed with equanimity. I don't know any American leaders that say, well, of course, China's a big power that has had a long history of civilizational greatness, so it's natural that China's doing well. What you hear is China's the great threat to the world. China's rise must be stopped. We must contain China. We must prepare for war. China cheated and stole its way to economic recovery or return. It's artificial. China will collapse. In other words, many erroneous, superficial, biased, sometimes blatantly racist views to undergird this sense of superiority in the US that built up over 2 centuries. So I thank you for taking the long view, because that's typically what is precisely missing in understanding the big changes of relative economic and technological uh, performance in our world today. It's a natural catching up of those who fell far behind in the last 2 centuries for a variety of fascinating and complex reasons. But that imbalance that developed favoring the North Atlantic relative to the rest of the world has diminished and basically is coming to an end at this point.
This is yeah, fascinating how the extreme economic imbalances give rise to ideologies, I guess, to explain the superiority of the where the power is concentrated. I think
And if I could say, Glenn,
yeah,
one thing that's interesting for me and very surprising, if you go to the writings of the greatest thinkers in Europe, uh, for example, the philosopher Immanuel Kant, who is no doubt one of the great geniuses of Western civilization, he has scattered through his writings. It wasn't his main preoccupation, but a very race-based view of European superiority. And one reads that with some shock because he was the great universalist. He was the great describer of, indeed, the categorical imperative, which set universal standards for behavior. But the idea that Europe is inherently the superior civilization is deeply embedded, of course, in a wide range of ideologies stretching back from the Renaissance to the Enlightenment, of course, to the period of Romantic nationalism in the 19th century, and on to Nazism and other ideologies of the 20th century that were based on superiority of race or religion or some other attribute of European culture that gave the right to dominate. And this is where so much goes wrong in our uh, thinking. Uh, these beliefs become deeply embedded, maybe not explicit, maybe they're even denied after a certain point, but they're embedded in the way that our governments, our states approach international issues.
I was at Immanuel Kant's 300-year birthday last year in Kaliningrad, and it did strike me some of the universalism behind it. There was some sense of superiority. But what was interesting with Samuel Huntington, he made this point that that the Western countries we tend to believe that we've been ruling the world for these centuries because of our superior ideas and values and ideology. But he made the point that it's really the mastered more efficient weaponry, controlled the sea lanes, and got a head start in the Industrial Revolution. And yeah, the rest of the world do not ignore this, that it was our organized violence. But how? But it begs the question: how will this lead to a different rule by China? Because if the Eurocentric world was, all these empires on a small continent, um, how yeah, this kind of formed our way of looking at the world, because our political theories tend to assume that you have this unavoidable geopolitical rivalry that is almost a law of nature. How do you think China would be different? Its geopolitical mentality would be different uh, than, for example, the way the Europeans have behaved, because we always assumed it's all universal.
This is also an absolutely fascinating and much debated question, I would say, but I have my own views, which I'll share. And that is that the decisive event in Western political culture, if I may put it that way, is 476 AD, which is the collapse of the Western Roman Empire when Rome is conquered by Germanic conquerors. And at that point, it was a long process, but with the fall of the Western Roman Empire, Europe fragmented into multiple political entities. In fact, the complete complex, remarkable kaleidoscope of political entities, of city-states and kingdoms and dukedoms and every conceivable form of political organization from the tiniest level up through would-be European-wide empires that never quite reached their billing, like the Holy Roman empire that Charlemagne, in effect, began. But as it was famously said, it was never quite wholly, never Roman, and never an empire in the way that it built itself. But the point is, Europe was and is and remained, despite Napoleonic aspirations, despite Charlemagne's aspirations, despite what Hitler tried, never became a unified political entity. And today's European Union is is a different kind and still very weak construction of some kind of European-wide political organization. Europe fragmented and basically engaged in within European war for 1,500 years. And war became the standard. And thinking about statecraft is thinking about conflict in Europe. And so the idea that statecraft is anarchic, the famous assumption of realism in international relations theory, is a a good first projection of European reality, roughly from around 500 AD to at least, let's say, to 1950. And the idea that states therefore collide with each other, compete with each other, fight with each other, conquer each other, defeat each other, succumb, and so forth is European statecraft thinking. China is very, very different in its history. China unified in 221 BCE in the Qin dynasty, the first unification. And China's geographically kind of a box. The box has dryland steppe region, so-called, to the north, the Himalayas to the west, the tropical forests of Southeast Asia to the south, and the East China Sea, the Pacific Ocean to the east. It's a box that became a state, a unified administrative state more than 2,000 years ago. China fragmented at times. The Qin dynasty gave way to the Han era. The Han era broke apart, then became later reunited in the Tang and the Song and the Yuan and the Ming and the Qing dynasties. But one could say that for most of the last 2,200 years, China's been a centralized administrative state. And the philosophy underpinning China is a Confucian philosophy that emphasizes the importance of harmony in keeping this integrated state functioning. Now, it's debated, does this lead to a different kind of statecraft of China? My answer is yes, it does actually. China does not think in terms of Western anarchic international statecraft. China thinks in terms of a large Chinese state where internal order is decisive and where external imperialism was never the rule for 2,000 years. China's vast and did not look for overseas territories. By and large, yes, one can point to particular places and episodes, but by and large, China had peaceful relations with its neighbors. I'll just give one example. From 1368, which is the beginning of the Ming Dynasty, to 1839, which is Britain's invasion of China in the First Opium War. So roughly for what is that, 500 years, China did not engage in almost any fighting with its East Asian neighbors, with Japan, with Korea, and with Vietnam. With Vietnam, there was about a 17-year period of war in the 15th century. With Korea, as far as I know, China never invaded Korea even once, but China was the dominant power. And in Western statecraft, you'd say, well, China would invade and take over. Never tried. China never, during this period, invaded Japan. Not even once. It was invaded by Japan once in 1592, I believe it is, or at least an attempt by a Japanese shogun, a military commander to invade China. It failed, of course. But in any event, you had essentially a half a millennium of peace in East Asia. It's sometimes called the Confucian Peace. Now, when I discussed this with our friend John Mearsheimer, a dear friend and a great political scientist, as far as I'm concerned, he says, no, 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 no. China will behave just the same way as any other great power. And he doesn't agree with this idea that China has a different kind of statecraft. I beg to differ. I love and admire John, but I disagree with him. I think China's view of statecraft is different, and it has been shaped by a different 2,000 years of history.
Professor Sachs, always fascinating to speak with you. So yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, I think this will be a key focus in the years to come. To what extent China is its statecraft is distinctively different from that of the Western. So it is. I would like to see you and Mersheimer in a debate about this. So thank you again for your
We'll
time.
continue the discussion. Great to be
Great.
with you.